Welcome to Dark History for Sleep. Tonight we descend into the golden blood-slick corridors of Imperial Rome, a city of beauty, of civilization, and of horror. Our guide is Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, Rome's fifth emperor, a man history remembers as a monster, but monsters are not born, they are built, and Nero's construction began with blood. He was born, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, in 37 CE, son of Gnaeus Domitius, a man so cruel even Rome feared him, and Agrippina the Younger, sister to the emperor Caligula. A woman history would come to call more serpent than mother. She saw her son not as a child, but as a tool, a way back into power after her exile. When Lucius was just 3, his father died, likely poisoned, and Agrippina began her climb. She seduced her own uncle, Emperor Claudius, and married him, an unholy union designed for one goal, to make her son the next emperor. But she had Claudius adopt Lucius, renamed him Nero, and began eliminating every rival, including Claudius's own son, Britannicus. Then Claudius died, not by accident. Ancient historians whisper that Agrippina fed him poisoned mushrooms at dinner, served with a smile, delivered by a slave trained in silence. The emperor gasped, vomited, collapsed, and with no investigation, no trial, no delay, Nero, age 16, became Emperor of Rome. He didn't seize the throne, he was placed on it, by a mother who ruled through whispers, seduction, and daggers. And for a while, she remained the real power behind the crown, until Nero decided he wanted to rule alone, and for that, Rome would pay. At 16, Nero was Rome's youngest emperor. He spoke softly. He loved poetry, music, and the arts. He walked the gardens of the Palatine Hill like a student, not a god. And for a few short months, Rome believed it might be blessed with peace. He gave speeches about compassion, lowered taxes, freed slaves, banned blood games for a time. They called it a golden dawn, but golden light can be deceiving, especially when it reflects off daggers. Nero's mother, Agrippina, still ruled in all but name. She sat behind the throne at public appearances, had her image stamped beside his on coins, even addressed the Senate behind veiled curtains. And Nero began to feel suffocated, watched, directed, like a puppet in a theater he didn't write. He wanted freedom, he wanted love, he wanted power, and Agrippina, ambitious, ruthless, proud, would give him none. Nero's first act of defiance was Octavia, his stepsister and now wife by imperial design. But his heart belonged to Poppaea Sabina, a woman as dangerous as she was beautiful. Agrippina disapproved. She reminded Nero who made him emperor, who placed the crown, who killed for him. So he responded by making his first kill. His target, Britannicus, the son of Claudius, Nero's adoptive brother, and the only other true heir to the Roman throne. One night, during a dinner banquet, Britannicus drank from his cup and collapsed, convulsed, foamed at the mouth. He died in full view of the imperial court, poisoned by Nero's own command. The guests were silent. Nero waved his hand. The body was removed, and the message was clear. The crown is mine, Rome is mine, and now blood is mine too. Mother, manipulator, matriarch of empire. She had outlived 3 husbands, survived exile, engineered a dynasty, but now she had made her greatest mistake. She raised a killer, and forgot she was no longer in control. At first, Nero tried to humiliate her. He moved her from the palace, stripped her of honors, removed her guards, made her a guest in her own empire. But Agrippina was not a woman to bow. She remained visible, spoke to senators, threatened to promote Rubellius Plautus, a distant relative, as a new heir. Nero heard everything, and his patience snapped. So he plotted murder, but not a simple execution. No, that would be too direct, too Roman. This would be a death designed as a performance. He invited Agrippina to a feast near the coast, made peace, smiled, kissed her hand, then offered her a boat to sail home, a pleasure craft, a gift from a son to a mother. It was rigged to collapse at sea. That night, the boat's mechanism failed. It didn't sink fast enough. Agrippina escaped, swam to shore, bruised, soaked, angry, but alive. When Nero heard, he panicked. He sent a message. "Is she dead?" The reply, "She has survived." The next order was swift, a sword, a killer, a private villa. The assassin found her in her chamber. She saw the blade. Her final words, "Strike my womb first," the place that bore the monster. Agrippina's murder shocked even Rome, not because it was cruel, but because it was matricide, unforgivable, unnatural. Nero staged a public funeral, wept for the crowds, but behind closed doors, he celebrated. He was now truly emperor, alone, unchained, and capable of anything. With Agrippina gone, Nero finally had what he always wanted, unquestioned power. But power, without restraint, does not produce peace. It produces spectacle. And Nero was not a statesman. He was not a soldier. He was an actor, and the empire would become his stage. He began to surround himself with flatterers, poets, singers, dancers, yes-men who praised his beauty, his voice, his divine genius. The Senate grew nervous. Generals whispered behind closed doors. But Nero didn't care. He declared himself the new Apollo, god of music and light. He began to appear in public wearing golden robes, hair curled in Greek style, lyre slung over his shoulder. He performed on stage, sang operas, played harp for hours, while the Roman elite were forced to watch and clap and cry. Even when the doors were barred, even when nobles fainted from heat and boredom, no one dared leave. To do so might mean death. Nero ordered the construction of palaces beyond imagining. Golden walls, rotating dining rooms, statues of himself so large they dwarfed temples. He hosted feasts that stretched from dusk to dawn. Guests were forced to drink, to laugh, to applaud as Nero recited poetry about his greatness. Servants who displeased him disappeared. Friends who spoke too freely found floating in fountains. He even staged a mock wedding to a boy named Sporus, a castrated slave who resembled Nero's murdered wife. Nero played the bridegroom, Sporus the empress. A full Roman ceremony, complete with veils and vows. Even the gods must have recoiled. But the empire wasn't laughing. The treasury drained. The army murmured. The provinces stirred. And deep inside the palace, Nero began to feel it. That old familiar fear that someone, somewhere, was plotting to take what was his. The murders would begin again. In a kingdom ruled by theater, truth becomes treason. And for Nero, truth was everywhere. A glance, a pause before clapping, a senator too quiet during a performance, a poet who once praised another man. Each of these became threats, and threats meant death. He turned inward, not to reflect, but to punish. He unleashed his spies, his informants, his torturers. Rome became a city of whispers. A single word spoken in confidence could end a life. Neighbors accused neighbors, sons reported fathers, and always, Nero watched. One by one, he eliminated those who had once been closest to him. Seneca, his old tutor, philosopher, and once beloved guide, commanded to commit suicide. Seneca obeyed. He opened his veins in a warm bath, but his blood ran slow, so they poisoned him. Still he lingered. Finally, they suffocated him. It took hours. Nero called it honorable. Lucan, the poet who once wrote epics about Roman virtue, accused of conspiracy, he too was ordered to die. As his veins opened, he recited his own poetry aloud. His final words were verse. Then came nobles, generals, family. If a man held land, if he had loyal soldiers, if his name drew cheers in the forum, he was dangerous. Some were exiled, others were tortured, many were quietly killed and erased from memory. Soon no one knew who might be next. Senators wept in private. Courtiers rehearsed their laughter. Even the imperial guards began to look away when Nero passed. The empire wasn't just bleeding, it was terrified. And in that terror, Nero felt powerful, worshipped, untouchable. But fear cannot hold a city forever. And soon, a fire would test his illusion of control. July 18th, 64 CE. The wind was hot, the air dry, and somewhere in the crowded maze of Roman tenements, a flame caught. A cart overturned, a spark leapt, and a fire began. Within hours, the fire leapt from one quarter to another. Rome, built of wood and packed tight with the poor, became a torch. Panic spread faster than the flames. Temples ignited, warehouses collapsed, animals screamed in the streets, families tried to flee, but the roads were blocked. Smoke choked entire neighborhoods. The Tiber itself shimmered orange with reflected firelight. For 6 days, the city burned. Then it stopped, only to start again, worse than before. Some said they saw men throwing torches, deliberately stoking the flames. Rumors spread, and all of them pointed to one man, Nero. He was not in Rome when it started, but he returned quickly, set up relief efforts, opened his palaces to the homeless, fed the starving, but the damage was done. 10 of Rome's 14 districts were scorched, and when asked how it happened, people whispered, he did it. He wanted a blank slate. He stood on his balcony and played the lyre. No one could prove it, but the idea was enough, that their emperor had watched them burn and smiled. Why would he do it? Some said he wanted to build his Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a palace so vast it required a city destroyed to make room. With a rotating dining hall, a lake, a colossal statue of himself as a god. It would rise from Rome's ashes, and so would Nero's legend. But legends demand sacrifices, and to silence the rumors, Nero needed a new target, someone to blame. They were a small, scattered sect. No temples, no idols, no sacrifices, just whispered prayers in underground rooms, communal meals called love feasts. A strange new messiah from Judea. The Romans didn't understand them. They didn't try. They only knew the Christians refused to worship the emperor, refused to offer incense, refused to bow. That was enough. Nero needed a scapegoat, and the Christians were perfect. He declared them guilty of arson, claimed they had set fire to Rome as vengeance, an act of divine rebellion. Then, with imperial approval, the roundups began. At first, just a few were arrested, then dozens, then hundreds, dragged from homes, pulled from catacombs, sold out by neighbors terrified to be associated. Nero did not merely execute them, he made it a show. Some were sewn into animal skins, then released into arenas to be torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified, nailed to crosses outside the city. But the most infamous fate was reserved for nightfall. Nero ordered Christians coated in pitch and resin, tied them to poles in his private gardens, and at night set them on fire. They burned like torches, alive, screaming. Nero walked among them in costume. dressed as a charioteer, singing to his guests, hosting banquets by the light of burning human bodies. He called it justice. The people called it madness. Even hardened Roman spectators began to turn away. But Nero didn't stop. He had tasted spectacles soaked in blood, and there was no going back. Poppaea Sabina, Nero's empress, the woman for whom he destroyed his first marriage, the woman who seduced her way into a throne. She was cunning, beautiful, feared, and for a time, Nero's obsession. But obsessions decay. By 65 CE, the fire in their marriage had cooled. She was pregnant, irritable, distant. And Nero, wrapped in paranoia and performance, had grown impatient. One evening, in a fit of rage, he struck her, not once, not a slap, but a brutal, repeated kick to her belly. She collapsed, bleeding, silent. Within hours, both Poppaea and her unborn child were dead. The emperor wept, not for her, but for the idea of her. He had loved the image, not the woman. And now that the image was gone, he had to find a way to bring it back. He searched Rome for a new wife, someone with Poppaea's grace, her face, her softness. He found a young boy. The boy's name was Sporus. Delicate features, wide eyes, barely a teenager. Nero had him castrated, dressed in silks, taught to walk and speak like Poppaea. Then he married him, held a public ceremony, declared Sporus his empress. The court was horrified, but no one spoke, because they had seen what happened to those who questioned the emperor's grief. You died, or worse, became part of his performance. And so the empire watched as Nero wept for the wife he killed and kissed the boy he mutilated to keep her ghost alive. By now, Rome had grown used to Nero's madness, the lies, the lavish feasts, the burning bodies, but behind the masks of loyalty, the empire seethed. And in 65 CE, a plot was born, the most serious conspiracy yet. Led by Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a wealthy noble orator and senator with ambition carved into every word he spoke. They called it the Pisonian Conspiracy. It wasn't just idle talk. It was detailed, coordinated, and wide-reaching. Senators, knights, military officers, poets, even philosophers like Seneca were implicated. Their plan was simple: assassinate Nero during a public performance, proclaim Piazzo Emperor, restore dignity to Rome. But Rome by now was a city of informants. Someone spoke, and the conspiracy unraveled. The response was not swift. It was surgical. Nero unleashed the Praetorian Guard, the imperial police, his own personal death squad, arrests, tortures, interrogations. Dozens were executed. Others were ordered to die by their own hand. A grim mercy in Nero's court. Lucan, the poet, died with verse on his lips. Seneca, already watched, opened his wrists in a final act of stoic obedience. Even Tigellinus, Nero's feared advisor, hesitated at the bloodshed. But Nero didn't flinch. He saw it as vindication, proof that everyone was an actor, every smile a mask, every ally a potential killer. And so, Nero withdrew even further from reality, into the theater, into music, into a fantasy where he could never be hurt. But Rome had changed. It no longer feared him, it pitied him, and soon it would turn. For 10 years, Nero ruled with fire and fear, but fear has limits. And beyond the marble statues and silk-draped palaces, Rome's provinces had begun to rot. The legions, those iron-hearted soldiers who bled for emperors, were no longer proud, no longer loyal. They were hungry, unpaid, ignored. While Nero composed ballads, the empire's frontiers crumbled. In Britain, revolt boiled. In Gaul, tax burdens became unbearable. And in the East, governors grew bold. The first to rise was Vindex, governor of Gaul. He denounced Nero publicly, called him a disgrace to Rome. Then came Galba, governor of Hispania, who declared himself imperator. These were not distant whispers. These were open rebellions, and worse, Nero's own generals refused to act. Panic returned to Nero like an old friend. He accused the Senate of conspiracy, demanded executions, planned a grand exodus to the east where he would reinvent himself as a Greek god. But the Senate had heard enough. The Praetorian Guard, the very men sworn to protect him, turned. They declared Nero an enemy of the state. Suddenly, the man who had burned cities and crucified the innocent was alone. No guards, no allies, no crown. He fled Rome on horseback, disguised, terrified, begging for refuge from freedmen and servants. By the time messengers reached him, they brought a chilling truth. The Senate has condemned you. You will be beaten to death in the Forum. And with that, the final act of Nero's reign began. It was early June, 68 CE. Nero had fled to a small villa just outside Rome, once a palace of song and spectacle, now a borrowed estate, abandoned and cold. He paced the rooms, begged for a sword, begged for poison. No one would give him one. Even his most loyal freedmen looked away. He tried to escape to the east, to Egypt, to Greece, anywhere that still remembered the boy who sang. But the ports were closed, the ships silent. Rome was no longer his. He received word from the city. You are to be beaten to death, in public, as an enemy, as a disgrace. He collapsed, sweat, tears, terror. He begged his companions to kill him. They refused. He took a dagger, tried to press it into his own chest, but froze. His hands trembled. The artist could face crowds, blood, and crucifixions. But not this, not himself. Then came the sound. Horses, the Senate's men, coming to drag him to his punishment. Nero turned to his scribe, Epaphroditus, and begged for help. The dagger was placed in his hand, guided to his throat. He whispered his final words, Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. And with that, Nero drove the blade into his own neck. Barely. It wasn't deep enough. Epaphroditus finished the job. Rome's last Julio-Claudian emperor bled out alone in a villa that wasn't his, in clothes not fit for an actor with no audience, no applause, and no legacy. Only silence. When word of Nero's death reached Rome, the city did not cheer. Not at first. There was no parade, no public execution, no satisfying end. Just a rumor that the emperor had taken his own life. And with that whisper, the streets were silent. Then, like floodgates shattering, the empire exploded. Statues were torn down, portraits smashed, his name scratched from temples, coins, monuments. The Senate declared a damnatio memoriae, a curse of memory. Nero was to be forgotten, erased, unmade. But erasure is not the same as peace. For years afterward, impostors appeared, men claiming to be Nero, rising from the east, with lyres in their hands and songs on their lips. Some claimed the real Nero had escaped, that he would return as a god, to punish the unfaithful, to reclaim the empire. One impostor even gathered an army, another was crucified while singing. But the myth refused to die. Because for all his cruelty, for all the screams and fires, Nero had become unforgettable, not just for the horrors he created, but for how deeply he revealed the rot in Rome itself. And so begins segment 2, the cult of decay. Over the next 9 parts, we descend into the Rome Nero left behind, a world of shattered politics, paranoid successors, and emperors who learned from Nero not to avoid cruelty, but to refine it. When Nero died, he left no heir, no plan, no future, just a throne soaked in fear, and a city that had forgotten how to trust. Within weeks, 4 men would claim the imperial crown, and Rome, already bleeding, would begin to devour itself. The first was Galba, governor of Hispania, old, cold, paranoid. He marched into Rome with legions at his back and immediately began executing Nero's allies. But the people missed Nero's games. The soldiers missed his gifts. And Galba, with no charm and no treasury, became hated almost overnight. Within months, he was beheaded in the Forum, his body dumped, his head paraded on a spear. Next came Otho, a former friend of Nero. He promised a return to stability, to peace. But another general, Vitellius, was already marching from the Rhine. The legions clashed, Rome wept, and Otho, fearing civil war, killed himself rather than fight. Vitellius took the throne next. He ruled with excess, drunkenness, and apathy, a grotesque echo of Nero's worst indulgences. But another threat rose from the east. Vespasian, a battle-hardened general, praised by his men, respected by the provinces. He marched on Rome. Vitellius resisted. The streets became a battlefield. By year's end, Rome had seen 4 emperors. 3 were dead. 1 stood triumphant, but surrounded by a city of broken buildings and mass graves. The year of the 4 emperors wasn't just chaos. It was a reflection, a mirror held up to the empire revealing what Nero had truly left behind. Not just tyranny, but a blueprint for power soaked in murder. Vespasian rose not through bloodlines, but through war, a soldier first, a tactician second, a Roman to the bone. He promised no poetry, no theater, no excess, only order. And Rome, exhausted by chaos, embraced him. But order, under Vespasian, would come at a cost. In Judea, revolt had flared. Nero had ignored it. Rome had let it fester. Now Vespasian turned his eyes to Jerusalem, a sacred city that had dared to defy the empire. He left the siege to his son, Titus, and Titus delivered destruction. In 70 CE, after months of blockade, starvation, and slaughter, Jerusalem fell. The Romans tore through the city. The Second Temple, holiest place in Judaism, was set on fire. Its gold melted into the cracks of stone. Priests were butchered at the altar. Children crucified outside the gates. The city was leveled, its people enslaved. The survivors scattered. Over 1 million lives were lost in the siege, according to Roman accounts. And the spoils of that war? They built the Colosseum, funded by Jewish treasure, constructed by Jewish slaves. Vespasian had restored Rome, but not through peace, through terror, a different kind than Nero's. Less theatrical, more permanent. He had shown that Rome didn't need a madman to burn cities, just a ruler with a purpose. And behind it all, Nero's ghost still lingered. The empire had learned his lesson. Power demands sacrifice, and the world, if it resists, must be made to kneel. Vespasian had brought stability, but stability in Rome was a temporary illusion. When he died in 79 CE, his son Titus ruled briefly, long enough to see a volcanic nightmare bury Pompeii, and then die mysteriously himself. The next emperor, Domitian, would pick up where Nero left off. But he didn't need music or theater or gold. He ruled by fear. Domitian dressed like a god, insisted on being addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. He revived trials for treason, rebuilt the secret police, and redefined loyalty as silence. Under his reign, informants thrived. A glance could be a crime. A joke could mean death. Philosophers were exiled. Writers executed. Senators vanished. The Senate itself became a graveyard of nodding heads. Palace staff were interrogated, guards tortured, even Domitian's own relatives were watched. He kept a knife under his pillow, refused to be seen in daylight, and consulted astrologers daily for signs of betrayal. One advisor warned him, "Your murderer is near." Domitian killed the man. But prophecy, like fate, does not care for violence. In 96 CE, his own wife's steward and court officials stabbed him to death in his chambers. It took 7 blows. The Senate rejoiced, had his statues smashed, declared his memory damned. But by then the lesson was clear. Nero's world had not ended. It had become the model. Every emperor since, no matter how noble or cruel, looked back at Nero and saw not a cautionary tale, but a blueprint for rule by fear. In Nero's day, the games were distraction. In Domitian's, they became doctrine. But under the Flavian emperors, Titus, Domitian, and their dynasty, Rome's thirst for violence was institutionalized. The Colosseum, also called the Flavian Amphitheater, opened in 80 CE. A monument to empire, funded by the sack of Jerusalem, built by slaves. Its purpose was simple: to feed the masses' blood. Tens of thousands of citizens poured into its marble jaws. Children, mothers, slaves, senators, all came to watch human beings die. Gladiators, condemned criminals, prisoners of war, thrown into the sand to kill or be killed. Animals were brought from across the empire: lions from Africa, tigers from India, crocodiles, elephants, rhinos. Men were mauled alive for entertainment, sometimes tied to stakes, other times armed with wooden swords for sport. And when the novelty wore thin, Rome turned to the mythical. Where executions were dramatized as plays, prisoners forced to reenact scenes from mythology, except their deaths were real. Prometheus devoured by vultures, Orpheus torn by beasts, Icarus thrown from great heights. Even naval battles were staged. The arena flooded with water, prisoners dressed as sailors, forced to drown or kill for cheers. But it wasn't cruelty alone. It was politics. Bred in circuses, the saying went, feed the poor, entertain the mob, and they won't ask questions. They won't care who rules, so long as the blood keeps flowing. And it worked. While provinces rebelled and emperors plotted, Rome sat in the stands, applauding death, not realizing that every spectacle was a rehearsal for their own fall. To entertain a city like Rome, a city of over 1 million souls, required blood. Not once, not occasionally, but daily. And that blood had to come from somewhere. The empire became a hunting ground. Wars weren't just about land or loyalty. They were about bodies. Every battle meant new captives. Every rebellion crushed added to the supply. Prisoners of war weren't just shackled. They were sorted. Some went to mines, some to brothels, others to the arena. Gladiators were trained at special schools, ludi, beaten, starved, conditioned like animals. They were fed just enough to survive, given nicknames, costumes, and roles. Some became crowd favorites, others disposable villains. Victory did not mean freedom, only survival until the next show. But the condemned, those with no training, no choice, suffered most. They were executed for entertainment, stripped naked, raped before audiences, mutilated for laughs. Some were blinded first, others burned alive. No story was too cruel, no method too indecent. Because the mob no longer saw people, only roles. Behind the marble walls, slave labor kept the theater running. They hauled beasts in chains, cleaned blood from sand, removed corpses between acts. Their reward? Silence, and the knowledge that they might be next. Rome's cruelty was efficient, not chaotic like Nero's, not paranoid like Domitian's. It was bureaucratic. A machine of flesh, gears greased with screams, and it ran for centuries. Rome had crossed a threshold. It no longer merely tolerated cruelty, it celebrated it, rewarded it, expected it. And when the mob grows numb, the ruler must grow more obscene to command their attention. Enter the emperors of excess. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, born in privilege, bathed in wine, worshipped as a god. He didn't just sponsor games, he starred in them. Entered the Colosseum as a gladiator, armed with real weapons, facing disabled or weakened slaves. He killed hundreds. Once he decapitated an ostrich, walked the arena holding its head, and glared at senators. A silent threat. They applauded. They had no choice. He taxed Rome to fund his fantasies, changed the months to reflect his name, called himself Hercules Reborn. Eventually, his paranoia deepened. He executed friends, poisoned lovers, fought imaginary conspiracies, until, finally, his own concubine had him strangled in the bath. But even his death wasn't the end. It was just another act. Rome had become a stage of emperors performing insanity and dying to applause. Caracalla, who bathed in the blood of his brother, Elagabalus, who married a Vestal virgin, sacrificed children, and drowned dinner guests in rose petals, each ruled by spectacle, each fell by betrayal, because Rome by then was unleadable. Too decadent to govern, too numb to mourn, and at the center of it all still echoed the ghost of Nero, not mourned, not honored, but imitated, not a madman, not a warning, a prototype. In Rome, cruelty was performance. In the provinces, it was policy. And nowhere was it felt more deeply than in Judea. The Jewish people, proud, monotheistic, resistant to Roman gods, never fully submitted to Roman rule. They paid taxes, but not respect. They obeyed laws, but not hearts. Rebellions simmered for decades, and Rome responded the only way it knew how, with fire, crosses, and salt. Even before Vespasian's war, crucifixion had become common. It wasn't just punishment, it was deterrence, public, prolonged, political. Victims were stripped naked, beaten until unrecognizable, then nailed to crosses on roadsides, sometimes left for days, their agony on full display, birds picked at eyes, insects feasted on wounds, children walked past as part of daily life. This was not an aberration, it was the point. In one rebellion alone, under Emperor Tiberius, over 2,000 crucifixions were carried out in a single season. And after Jerusalem fell in 70 CE, thousands more were nailed to crosses outside the ruined city. Too many to count, too many to bury. The roads into the province were lined with the dead, a forest of human agony. Rome believed this brought peace, order, but it did something else. It planted the seed of hatred, of resistance, of future wars that would never fully die. And it wasn't just Judea. The same pattern repeated in Britain, Gaul, North Africa. Wherever Rome went, blood followed, because empire, in its purest form, is not ruled from a throne, but from the fear carved into a prisoner's back. In 60 CE, the province of Britain was raw, newly conquered, and restless. Rome had subjugated most of the tribal kingdoms, but not their hearts, not their pride. Among these tribes, the Iceni were granted a fragile peace. Their king, Prasutagus, ruled as a client ally of Rome. But peace with an empire is always temporary. When Prasutagus died, he left his kingdom to be shared between his daughters and the emperor. Rome took everything. They stormed the Iceni lands, seized property, flogged nobles, and in an act of pure humiliation, they raped Boudicca's daughters. Then they scourged Boudica herself, naked, before her people. She was queen, mother, widow, And now, revenge. Boudica rose like a storm. She united tribes, summoned warriors, and unleashed hell. The revolt struck 3 cities in succession: Camalodunum, Londinium, Verulamium, modern Colchester, London, St. Albans. Each one was burned. Its Roman occupants slaughtered: men, women, children. Some were impaled. Others burned alive inside temples. Skulls were left in sacrificial piles. According to Roman sources, over 70,000 were killed. Rome panicked, but they responded with overwhelming force. A single Roman legion, outnumbered, outmatched, defeated Boudica's army in a brutal, disciplined massacre. Boudica, rather than face capture, drank poison. Her daughters, raped by empire, vanished from history. Rome reclaimed the land, rebuilt the cities. But the memory could not be burned, because Britannia learned, like Judea, that Roman peace was not built with olive branches, but with ash and graves. Before Nero, before emperors became gods, there was Caesar, and in 52 BCE, he faced his greatest challenge, a tall, flame-haired Gaul named Vercingetorix, a tribal prince, a charismatic warrior, and the last hope of a free Gaul. The Gallic tribes were scattered, divided by rivalry and fear. Vercingetorix changed that. He united them, not with flattery, but with fire. He convinced them to burn their own fields, starve their own land, so that Rome would have nothing. He waged a war of resistance, and at first, it worked. Roman supply lines failed. Legions froze in the wild. Whole towns rose in rebellion. Caesar was cornered. But at Alesia, the tide turned. Vercingetorix and his forces were besieged, starved, surrounded. Gaul sent a relief army, 250,000 strong by some accounts. But Caesar trapped himself, built double walls, one to hold Vercingetorix in, one to keep rescuers out. The Gauls were crushed. Vercingetorix surrendered, dignified, silent. He did not beg. He did not kneel. He threw his weapons at Caesar's feet, and Caesar imprisoned him for 6 years, not to torture, not to execute, but to save him as a living trophy. In 46 BCE, Caesar held a triumph in Rome: chariots, gold, slaves, animals, and at the end in chains, Vercingetorix, once the most feared man in Gaul, now walked like a beaten dog. He was led through the streets, mocked by cheering Romans. At the end of the parade, he was strangled in the Tullianum prison, a pit beneath the earth, alone. Rome had won. Gaul was pacified, its language, culture, and pride absorbed. But in every French myth, in every whisper of resistance, the ghost of Vercingetorix still marches. Rome prided itself on law, the 12 tables, the Senate, the forums, the rhetoric of justice. They claimed to bring order to chaos, civilization to savagery. But Roman law was never blind. It was a sword held by the strong and a chain fastened around the weak. In the provinces, governors wielded law like a dagger. If a merchant complained, his assets were seized. If a noble protested taxes, his family was exiled. If a village resisted conscription, its elders were crucified as a warning. There were no appeals, no juries of peers, only men in white robes, quoting Cicero, while slaves screamed outside. Even in the city of Rome, the illusion cracked. Trials became performance. Senators bribed judges. Poets were exiled for lines displeasing the emperor. Philosophers, like Seneca, were forced to choose between obedience or suicide. And for the poor, justice meant nothing. They could be beaten in the street, forced into labor, thrown into dungeons for debts. Women had no rights against husbands. Slaves had none against masters. A Roman father could kill his own child and face no punishment. In theory, law kept the empire stable. In practice, it made oppression look reasonable. Every chain had paperwork, every scream a signature. And so, cruelty became ordinary. Not monstrous, just legal. That is the genius of empire. When violence no longer shocks, and injustice speaks Latin. Rome called itself a republic, a civilization of laws, a culture of arts. But behind every marble column, every aqueduct, every feast, stood a slave. Not one, not a few, but millions. At its height, nearly 1 in 3 people in Italy was enslaved. They came from everywhere: Greece, Africa, Gaul, the Levant, the Germanic forests, captured in war, born in chains, or sold by desperate families. Some became tutors, doctors, accountants, others gladiators, miners, sex workers, or field hands. If you were lucky, you died quickly. If not, you lived long enough to be broken. In Sicily and Spain, whole mountains were hollowed by slave miners, working in darkness, breathing poison. In Roman kitchens, cooks were beaten for bad meals. In brothels, girls as young as 9 were rented by the hour. Slave children were sold with tags on their arms, listing their flaws. Talks too much, prone to illness, disobedient. They could not marry, could not testify, could not own anything. And if a master was killed, every slave in the household was executed. It didn't matter if you were guilty. It didn't matter if you were 5 years old. Rebellion was rare because punishment was swift, and memory was erased. Spartacus rose once, led tens of thousands in revolt, and was crucified with his followers, 6,000 crosses lining the Appian Way. A message written in bodies: Rome owns you. This wasn't a flaw, it was the system. Rome thrived because of slavery, and collapsed in part because it depended on a silence no human being could maintain forever. Rome remembered its emperors, its generals, its poets, and martyrs. But most of all, Rome remembered its victors, and if you weren't strong, or useful, or beautiful, you were forgotten, or worse. The sick were feared: leprosy, tuberculosis, pox. Diseases Rome couldn't cure were met with superstition and exile. Some sufferers were cast out of cities, left to die beyond the walls. Others were hidden in basements or burned alive in plague purges. The disabled were ridiculed. Deformed infants were often killed at birth, especially if born into poverty. A Roman proverb said, "Raise the strong, expose the weak." Unwanted babies were left at crossroads, naked and crying, hoping to be taken by strangers. Most were not. Even the elderly suffered, unless wealthy old age meant irrelevance. Rome did not glorify aging. It mocked frailty. Pensioners starved, widows begged, and those with no family simply vanished. Mental illness? There were no asylums, no compassion. Madness was a divine curse, a sign of weakness or a source of entertainment. Some were paraded through streets, others chained in temples. Most suffered in silence. No tombs, no poems, no legacy. Just bones beneath the empire, fertilizing a civilization that celebrated glory and denied the broken ever existed. Rome burned. It always burned. But this fire, the one they tried to put out with blood, refused to die. It spread not through temples or palaces, but in catacombs, graves, whispers. It spread through faith. The followers of Christ were few, poor, foreign. They didn't worship the emperor. They didn't offer sacrifices. They didn't attend the games. To Rome, they were unnatural, and to emperors who inherited Nero's paranoia, they were dangerous. The first persecutions came under Nero himself. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, he blamed the Christians. Not because they were guilty, but because they were hated. They were. arrested by the hundreds, torn apart by dogs in arenas, burned alive as human torches, crucified in gardens for sport. Tacitus wrote that even Rome pitied them, not for their beliefs, but because their suffering was so obscene. But it didn't end with Nero. Each generation found new reasons to kill. Under Trajan, Christians were punished for refusing pagan rites. Under Decius, they were forced to choose between faith and execution. Under Diocletian, entire communities were erased, churches were torn down, scriptures burned, bishops tortured, but the fire only grew stronger. The more Rome killed, the more the faith spread, not because the message was violent, but because the empire was. And cruelty, when repeated often enough, becomes its own confession. For centuries, Rome consumed the world. It devoured grain from Egypt, gold from Spain, silver from Britain, slaves from everywhere. But by the 3rd century, the world began to devour Rome. The economy collapsed, debased currency, hyperinflation, farmers abandoned fields, soldiers deserted borders, food grew scarce, prices soared, riots erupted in cities. The once mighty empire couldn't feed its own people. In some regions, desperate Romans turned to cannibalism. There were reports of parents selling children for grain. Others simply starved in the streets, too weak to even beg. Grain ships stopped coming. Trade routes collapsed. The Nile failed to flood. Rome was no longer the center of the world. It was a parasite on a dying host. And beyond the borders, the so-called barbarians watched, waited, gathered strength. The Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, once mocked as savages, now saw a bloated empire too weak to stand. One emperor after another rose and fell, assassinated, poisoned, overthrown. In just 50 years, Rome cycled through over 20 emperors. Most ruled for months, some for days. The throne was no longer power. It was a death sentence. And yet, the Senate still quoted Cicero, still built statues, still held games, because Rome could not imagine its own end, even as it starved on the steps of its own temples. For 8 centuries, Rome had been untouched. No foreign army had set foot in the city since the days of the early kings. Not Carthage, not the Gauls, not even Hannibal himself had breached the gates. Rome believed it was untouchable until 410 CE. The invaders were Visigoths, led by a man named Alaric. He had once fought for Rome. Now he turned against it. Why? Rome had betrayed its promises, delayed payments, insulted ambassadors, refused to treat the Goths as equals. They came not just for conquest, but for vengeance. On the night of August 24th, a gate was opened from within. The Visigoths flooded the city. Temples were ransacked, palaces looted, citizens slaughtered in their beds. Rome, once mistress of the world, was now a victim. St. Jerome, writing from the East, said, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." 3 days of chaos, and then silence. Not because Rome resisted, but because there was nothing left to take. The empire's capital had been gutted, its wealth stolen, its gods mocked, its illusion shattered. The sack was not total annihilation, but it didn't have to be. It was symbolic. The world saw it, felt it, and understood. Rome could fall. After the sack of 410, Rome never truly recovered. Its spirit was broken, its treasury empty, its armies foreign. But the name, Rome, still held weight, enough to keep the corpse animated long after the heart had stopped. The Western Roman Empire stumbled into the 5th century like a drunk into traffic. Germanic tribes took Gaul. The Vandals seized North Africa. Britain was abandoned completely. Italy itself became a battlefield. Not between Romans and enemies, but between rival barbarian kings. The emperors, mostly children, puppets, appointed by generals, deposed by courtiers, forgotten within months. The once glorious title of Caesar was now a mask for others to wear. In 455, the Vandals did what even the Goths hadn't. They sacked Rome again, this time with cruelty and precision. They stripped the city bare, destroyed what was left of its wealth, took hostages, treasure, and symbols. Even the golden menorah from the Jewish temple, once paraded by Titus through Rome, was looted and lost. Finally, in 476 CE, the charade ended. A boy named Romulus Augustulus, the last Western emperor, was forced to abdicate. He wasn't executed, just dismissed, sent into obscurity, because by then there was nothing left to rule. No legions, no grain, no gods, no glory, just ruins, echoes, and memory. But memory is a dangerous thing, because though Rome was gone, its ghost remained, in language, law, religion, power, and in every ruler who came after, dreaming of empire. Rome had fallen, its marble crumbled, its legions dispersed, its gods dethroned. But some things don't die, they infect. The world remembered Nero, not with reverence, but with fascination. He was not erased, he was studied. Kings copied his cruelty, popes feared his shadow, and dictators emulated his methods. Charlemagne crowned himself emperor on Christmas Day, 800 CE, not king of the Franks, not protector of Christendom, but Roman emperor. Because even in ashes, Rome meant legitimacy, and with that crown came its legacy of fear and flame. In the Renaissance, painters reimagined Nero as a decadent icon. Poets recast him as a tragic god. Philosophers debated whether he was evil or merely a mirror. Machiavelli hinted that cruelty, if used correctly, was a tool of genius, and Nero had shown the blueprint. In the 20th century, the lessons reappeared, dressed in uniforms, speaking through microphones, public executions, controlled spectacle, a state built on surveillance, paranoia, and myth. These weren't new ideas. They were Nero's, refined. Even now, his name lives in political speeches, historical analogies, internet jokes. But the real Nero, the architect of torment, the artist of fear, still sits quietly in history's corner, watching, waiting, smiling. To understand Nero, we return not to Rome, but to those he destroyed. Because in an empire ruled by fears, it's not only the killer who leaves a mark, it's the silenced. First, Agrippina the Younger, his mother, a woman who outlived rivals, manipulated emperors, and birthed a god-king. She poisoned her husband, Claudius, paved Nero's path to the throne, taught him that love was a transaction and power a blade. He thanked her by ordering her death. Then, Octavia, his first wife, young, noble, beautiful. Nero accused her of adultery, exiled her, then had her veins opened in a ritual killing. The public mourned, but Nero's new wife, Poppaea Sabina, applauded, until he kicked her to death while she was pregnant. Even his tutor, Seneca, the philosopher who preached virtue, couldn't escape. Though once his mentor, Seneca was forced to open his own veins, bleeding slowly into a bath. Not because he plotted treason, but because Nero feared his popularity. These weren't enemies. They were family, mentors, lovers. Each death didn't just feed Nero's power. It shaped his myth. Rome turned their stories into cautionary tales. Their names became symbols. And Nero, by contrast, became a black hole, the boy who killed everything that loved him and ruled a world that applauded as it bled. Nero never wanted to rule. He wanted to be admired, not for justice, not for conquest, but for beauty. He saw himself not as emperor, but as a god of the stage. He sang, he danced, he played the lyre. He built a theater inside the palace and forced the elite to attend. Nobles, generals, priests, all had to applaud. To yawn was treason. To leave early, a death sentence. He didn't just demand obedience, he demanded audience. At games, he dressed as mythological heroes: Achilles, Hercules, Apollo. He entered singing contests, rigged to guarantee his victory. One judge who gave him second place was later found dead. But this obsession ran deeper than vanity. It was escape. Nero couldn't be loved as emperor, so he became a character, a mask that couldn't bleed, a role where his cruelty became art. Even his murders had narrative flair. He didn't just poison. He orchestrated deaths as spectacles, fire, music, blood. He curated agony. To him, fear wasn't power. It was applause. And when rebellion finally came, he didn't gather armies. He didn't prepare defenses. He fled to a villa, asked friends to dig him a grave, held a dagger to his own throat, but hesitated until a servant helped him plunge it in. His last words, "What an artist dies in me." Nero's death was not the end of an era. It was the trigger of chaos. For the first time in over a century, Rome had no clear ruler, no heir, no plan. And into that void stepped ambition, greed, and betrayal. In 69 CE, the empire endured what would be called the Year of the Four Emperors. Galba, the old general, seized power, only to be murdered by his own troops. Otho replaced him, then lost a civil war and took his own life. Vitellius, bloated with excess and cruelty, was dragged through the streets and publicly executed. And finally, Vespasian took control, founding a new dynasty with blood on his hands. Rome burned, bled, and groaned. Legions fought legions. Cities declared loyalty, then changed sides. Massacres unfolded in forums once built for law. The Senate powerless, the people terrified. The empire had slain its artist emperor and now found itself in a theater of corpses. Worse still, many Romans mourned Nero. They remembered his games, his lavish gifts, his illusion of glory. And some believed he hadn't died at all. Rumors spread that Nero had survived, escaped east, would return, cloaked in vengeance. At least 3 false Neros rose in the following years, each greeted with hope, fear, or both. Why? Because even in madness, even in horror, Nero had given Rome something it understood: a spectacle. What came after was just chaos. Nero died in 68 CE, but in Christian scripture he lives forever, not as a man, but as a monster. In the book of Revelation, written decades after his death, scholars believe the beast, with 7 heads, 10 horns, and a number, 666, is a cipher for Nero Caesar. In ancient Hebrew numerology, Nero Caesar translates to that infamous number. To early Christians, he wasn't just a persecutor, he was evil incarnate. Stories spread of Nero's return, a myth called the Nero Redivivus legend. He would come back from the east, raise an army, and burn Rome again. Some believed he was in hiding, others that he had become something immortal, a king of cruelty beneath the earth, a spirit of tyranny reborn in every era. In medieval Europe, his name became a warning. Churches condemned him. Dante placed him in the Inferno. Painters rendered him as a demon, surrounded by smoke and screaming. And yet, he fascinated. Plays were written, operas performed, books romanticized his despair, because Nero, more than any emperor, became a story, not just of evil, but of charisma, collapse, and the fragile line between art and apocalypse. Even today, the name Nero echoes, in fiction, in film, in political commentary. He's not remembered for policy, not for reform, not even for his crimes. He is remembered as a symbol of how a single man's madness can consume an empire. After Nero died, Rome tried to erase him. His name was removed from inscriptions, statues smashed, coins melted. Even the Domus Aurea, his sprawling golden house, was buried, not by time, but by order. The Domus Aurea had once spanned 300 acres, a palace of unimaginable decadence. Gold ceilings, rotating banquet halls, artificial lakes, gardens filled with exotic animals. He had taken public land, homes, temples, and turned them into his playground. The Roman people hated it, saw it as the ultimate insult, so when he died, his successors filled it in with concrete and dirt, built public baths over its bones, out of sight, out of memory. But memory is never truly buried. In the 15th century, a Roman boy fell through a hole into a forgotten chamber. By torchlight, he saw frescoes, paintings untouched by time. Artists like Raphael and Michelangelo crawled into those ruins, copying the strange designs. Nero's aesthetic, his madness, whispered into the Renaissance. Today, parts of the Domus Aurea are open to the public, but most remain closed, too unstable, too dangerous. The Golden House is cracking, and beneath it, foundations sink, as if the earth itself resents the memory. What remains of Nero is not gold, not fire, not even bones. What remains is a question: how far can power go before it becomes rot? Rome didn't fall in a day. It fell like a body succumbing to poison, slow, internal, silent at first. The borders didn't collapse from enemies. They collapsed because no one inside could hold them up. The signs were everywhere. Inflation so wild. A loaf of bread could cost a day's wage. Generals more powerful than emperors. Civil wars fought not for principles, but for vanity. Citizenship sold for gold. Faith twisted into dogma. Tradition weaponized against change. Nero's Rome wasn't an anomaly. It was a warning, a mirror showing what happens when art becomes spectacle, law becomes cruelty, power becomes theater, and leadership becomes a game of ego and fear. What makes Nero terrifying is not his uniqueness. It's that he was predictable. An empire that values glory over justice will always breed tyrants. And those tyrants, if given enough applause, will believe they are gods. Rome died from within. Its buildings outlasted its virtues. Its fame outlasted its wisdom. And its name became a myth that every later power tried to copy. And none could escape. Not Byzantium, not the Holy Roman Empire, not Napoleonic France, not even the modern superpowers who study Rome's rise, but not its descent. There are no tombs for Nero, no shrine, no grave known to history. His body was burned, his memory cursed. And yet, he has never really left. He exists now in shadow. In every leader who demands worship, in every law that punishes dissent, in every theater of cruelty, in every crowd that confuses power with divinity. You've heard the stories. He played the lyre as Rome burned. He poisoned, stabbed, strangled. He turned murder into art. He ruled not as a man, but as a child, with absolute control over life and death. But here's the final truth. Rome was already dying. Nero just made it watch itself bleed. He didn't invent the cruelty. He inherited it, amplified it, reflected it back to the people like a mirror lined with fire. In the ruins of the Domus Aurea, in the cracked frescoes and sunless corridors, some say you can still hear something. Not footsteps, not whispers, just the faint, echoing pluck of strings, as if someone somewhere is still performing.